Hello, welcome to the week that was, a week in which capital letters were writ large across the news agenda. J for Jerusalem, C for capital, and a missing letter, U for undivided. So, President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, breaking a 7-decade-old policy, but simultaneously upholding a 1995 decision by Congress to do just that. Cue varying degrees of criticism from almost every country in the world, and varying degrees of outrage in the streets. There were protests in cities including Ramallah, Gaza, and Jerusalem, and further afield in Istanbul, Karachi, Lahore, Kuala Lumpur, and elsewhere. But, crucially, in his announcement, President Trump did not recognize Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital. And this means that the final status of the city is still to be determined, which in turn leaves the door open for East Jerusalem to be the capital of Palestine one day, perhaps. And that's one of the reasons why international criticism, even in the Middle East, was relatively muted. The other part, though, is part of a bigger picture. With wars in Yemen and Syria, Lebanon in such a fragile situation, terrorism in the Sinai, and the looming threat of Iran, the Arab states' minds are simply not focused on the plight of the Palestinians. Speaking of Yemen, chances of an early end to the war suffered a setback when the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was killed. The Gulf states involved in the military campaign against the Houthi rebels there had persuaded Saleh to break his alliance with the Houthis and bring his armed factions over to their side. The Houthis responded by murdering Saleh in the capital, Sana'a. He was famous for describing ruling Yemen as dancing on the heads of snakes. Well, one of them has now bitten him. Yemen's agony continues. Still in the Middle East, as predicted last week, Lebanon's Prime Minister Said Hariri retracted his resignation. By Friday, he was back in Paris and back representing his country in talks with the French government and the US Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Finally, 3 Bs: Brexit, Bitcoin, and beauty. The European Commission agreed that Brexit negotiations had achieved sufficient progress to move to the next phase of talks. British Prime Minister Theresa May and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker announced the deal in the early morning in Brussels. It must now be approved by EU leaders at the European Council meeting in the coming week. Now, this was just the divorce settlement parameters. That includes the rights of EU workers in the UK, for example. That still was excruciatingly difficult. And now comes the even more difficult negotiations over future trade deals. Bitcoin? It's money, but it doesn't exist except in the digital world and our imaginations. The digital currency is less than 10 years old. In 2011, one Bitcoin was worth $1. Just this September, it was at $3,500, and this week it broke the $17,000 barrier. Currently, it's worth a lot. Tomorrow, it'll be worth no one knows. Other cryptocurrencies are available. So, from what might be a beast to a beauty, you'd need quite a few Bitcoins to be able to hang this above your mantelpiece. Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci sold for $450 million in New York last month, destined for the Louvre at Abu Dhabi. Now, the masterpiece is thought to have been painted in around 1500, possibly for Louis XII of France. It ended up in the collection of Charles I of England, but it disappeared until 1900. And it will now be one of the star attractions of the Abu Dhabi Louvre. That was the week that was. See you next time.